If you've never woven before, you have no idea what warp or weft are, or where to even get started, then this is the perfect project for you. I'm going to go over the supplies you'll need, some basic stitches, how to get started, and how to finish the whole thing off so you'll have a nice little wall hanging for your home. Welcome to Foxtrot Studio. I'm Amanda. One of the nice things about learning to tapestry weave is that it's a pretty economical craft to get started with. You probably have a few of the things that you need around the house already. You need some chunky or bulky weight yarn for this project and on this particular loom. Once you get into weaving, you'll find that you need different weight yarns for different projects, just like knitting or crocheting. But for right now, for today, chunky weight, bulky weight yarn works great. You'll need a fork. The loom that I'm going to suggest comes with a fork, comes with a little fork, but I like these bamboo forks, but you can also use one of your regular metal dinner forks. It's really not all that important that you have a fancy weaving fork. And a pair of scissors. Some of the things you may need to purchase, I have linked down below. And the first one being a frame loom. It's this little handy guy. It's a pretty basic loom that we use for this project. They're very inexpensive and they actually come with two different sizes. They also come with a little fork, wooden needles, and some other supplies that we don't need for this project, but hold on to them because we may use them for another one. After you've done this project and you've fallen in love with tapestry weaving, I really encourage you to look into some higher quality looms. There's some really amazing artists out there that produce looms, and it's just such a beautiful tactile experience to weave on a high quality loom. Even a simple frame loom like this, the higher quality feels good. But this one's perfect to get you started. Like I said, it's on Amazon, and I have the link down below. A few other things you may want to grab are warping thread. This is 8/4 poly cotton warping thread. I usually buy it in a few different colors, but today we're just going to work in like an ecru. I like these long, cheap, I'm just going to say it, they're cheap. They're not just inexpensive, they're cheap. They're cheap plastic needles, and I like them because this length goes all the way, just about all the way across our loom, and it makes weaving a little bit easier. The last thing I think you should invest in is top. Hand-dyed top from an indie dyer is always a pleasure to work with. You're supporting the small cottage industry, and the colors are always fun and exciting. These I dye myself. Mine are a semi-solid, so I get different undulations of color across the length of the roving, but you can get them as wild and crazy as you want. And you'll see when we weave with them, the colors will change as you go. And all top is unspun wool. It's been prepped and dyed, ready for hand spinners to spin it on our spinning wheels, but we're gonna strip it apart and weave with it. The first thing we need to do is warp our loom, and the warps are the strings that go up and down and don't change, whereas the weft is what we weave in and out across the warps. And I do this a little bit differently than other people, but it'll help when we finish at the end. I just start with a slip knot. And attach it up here at the first peg. Put that in the back, and then keep some tension on it as you come down and come into the second peg down at the bottom, and then back up to the third. And then I flip the frame over and tie the tail to the warp. I try to keep tension on the warp at all times so that it's nice and taut. Tighten up the knot, do a second round, and then you're ready to go and warp across. And I just continue that pattern going down into the next peg, around the back, and then back up to the top. And it's important to keep a steady tension across all your warps. You don't want them too tight or too loose, just taut. And the most important part is that it's consistent across all of them. When I get to the end, I finish up at the top, the same place I started so that my knots are on the same side. Give it a cut. And then I'm going to loosen up the last 2 warps that I put on there and flip the frame over. But I keep my thumb in place on that 3rd warp so that the other warps don't loosen. Open up that warp just a little bit at the top, and then we're going to slip our tail through so we can do a knot to mirror the one on the other side. You may need to drop back down and tighten up your warps a little bit so that they're even again, and then go through to finish up the knot. Okay, and where we have our knots here, that's going to be the bottom of our weaving. And if you take a look at the top, the warps are now in a continuous loop. They're side by side and there's no free ends. And so that's going to come into play at the very end when we finish. Those will be like a closed circuit to put our dowel or stick through. We're going to start the project with a very basic stitch. So grab a nice long length of yarn, and you don't want it too long because you can only work as long as your arms are long. So make sure it's not too ridiculous, but you know, a good length to work with for a while, maybe about 4 or 5 feet. And we're going to begin the project with tabby stitch or plain weave. And that is simply going over, under, across the warps, all the way across the row. And I try to tuck as many tails in as possible. I'm going to wrap my tail around the last warp, in front of the second to last warp, and then behind the 3rd warp, so that when I squish it down, I have a little tail sticking out, but I'll trim that. Make sure that last warp doesn't get pulled in, and then you're just going to push everything down. And this is where our fork or a beater comes in handy to squish everything down as far as you can. Give it a little bit of a tug, but again, you want that warp on the far right to stay nice and straight, so don't pull too hard. And for the second row, we're just going to go opposite of what we did before. So if this last weft was under a warp, we're going to go over and start the pattern just the opposite, working across the other way. That allows your overs to stack on top of your unders and vice versa. Again, this is called plain weave or tabby stitch. So here we get to the end of weaving, and see, you don't want to pull straight across it. It makes your warps collapse. So I'm going to pick it back out, straighten everything up. And the trick here is to put your finger on that turnaround and then pull your weft up at an angle and then down to make a little hill. And that hill creates extra fabric so that when you beat it down, there's enough material to go in and out of the warps across, and then your warp on the edges stays nice and straight. We're going to keep working in this tabby stitch, alternating whether we start with over or under, until we have about 5 rows. And now we're going to add a little fringe at the bottom. I'm counting to see how many sets of 2 I have, so I know how many sets of fringe I need to make. And I'm going to use John Muir's book as my guide to wrap the yarn around. So I have 11 sets of warps. So 22 warps gives me 11 sets of warps. So I'll need 11 sets of fringe. And I want 4 strands of fringe per warp set. So I need 44 wraps around my John Muir book. And then cut the end up at the top where you started. And then I slide it off, making sure I keep my fingers, at least a thumb, in the center there. So now I'm just going to cut across all those tops. And now I'll grab 4 strands and set it off to the side. And to attach fringe, You're gonna find the middle of your fringe strands, and starting with the far left set of warps, I wrap my right side first and then my left, and you're gonna take your fringe and wrap around, and then you're gonna come between those two warps on the right, and then you wrap them under and around on the left, even up your ends, and then pull down. And then you're gonna get another set of 4. And the next set of 2 warps, I'm gonna wrap the right side around and down, the left side around and down, even up my ends, tighten it up, and then pull it down. I'm going to continue across the row, adding my fringe, and I'll have 11 sets of fringe at the end. Now that we have our fringe all set, I'm going to work 1 row of tabby or plain weave all the way across. And that just helps me reestablish my pattern that I have going. And beat the weft down with the fork really tight up against that fringe. And this next row of tabby is going to be the setup round for twining that I'm going to show you the next row. Make the hill and beat it down. Now if you take a look, the fringe that we put in caused our warps to partner up, and they're not evenly spaced across the row anymore. And we want to help add space between those so that they're even across the whole loom. And we're going to do a twining stitch. And the way to twine is you take a look at where the weft goes on top of the warp. And what you're going to do is take your needle from the left to the right behind the warp and the weft going down. So you're doing 2 motions, left to right and top to bottom, behind the warp and the weft. I'm actually skipping the second warp because that's where the weft went behind, and I'm gonna go to the third warp where the weft is on top again, and I'm gonna go left to right, top to bottom, behind the warp and the weft, making an X around that warp string. I'm going to skip the next warp, and again, where the weft goes over the top, I'm going to go top to bottom, left to right, behind the warp and weft. And you'll see how these are starting to lock into each other, and our warps are going to start evening out. And I just work this all the way across. And every once in a while, you want to give them a little tug to help balance out the tension between the 2 strands of weft. Another nice thing about twining stitch is that it kind of resets your pattern. So if for any reason you get off with your over-unders with your plain weave, then you can do a row of twining and it reestablishes your pattern, because the next row is fairly arbitrary whether you start over, under, over. So I'm going to work a few rows of tabby here, and then we're going to get to adding in poofies. On my example here, I have these nice big poofs, and I'm going to take a length of top, or roving. Sometimes you'll hear me call it roving, but they're kind of interchangeable. I don't want my poofs that big, so I'm going to split the top lengthwise. Then I'm going to go under the first warp, and I'm going to let my poofs have some room to breathe. So we're not going to go under over each warp. We're going to skip 2 warps, go over 2 and under 1. And that'll give our poofs, for lack of a better term, our poofs some space to expand a little bit, especially because we're using a full half width of our top on such a small project. So I'm going to keep that pattern going, over 2, under 1, all the way across. And you can see I keep squish my fibers down. And You can choose whether you keep them in a nice tidy straight row or you start letting them twist around or force them to twist. I like letting them do their own thing and twisting a bit, so that's what I'm adjusting. And then I tuck the ends to the back to keep them out of the way. And I'm going to do another row of plain weave. When you start beating down your top rows, that's when the poof magic really happens. And now you can let your creativity and artistic eye play a little bit. This is a time to start changing colors if you'd like with your weft. I'm just using cream right now. I'm going to build up a few rows of this tabby stitch. I have enough tabby stitch now for me to start adding some more smaller poofs, and here I'm going to split my roving into quarters lengthwise so that I can make these little poofs that are different from the big poofs. And then again, I like trying to remember to weave in my ends as I go. So I just wrap around the last stitch, drop down a row, and hide it back there. For the smaller poofs, I'm going to go under 2, over 2 across, and that'll make them nice and even. And it'll give me a pattern to work the next row just the opposite. Kind of like tabby by 2s. And I take it all the way across, tuck my end in, and I beat it down a little bit to see how much poof is coming out, and then I go back and adjust and pull it across so that my poofs really pop out. And this is up to you how big your poofies are, how small, and just remember as you keep working up on top of it, they'll pop out even more than what you see here. So I'll do my next row just the opposite. See, this row I'm keeping a little bit tidier so that they don't twist, and it gives me more of like a checkerboard effect instead of like a cloud effect. And the third row, just the opposite again. And then I open up my top just a little bit. It helps with pulling it apart, basically cutting it, and then I wrap it around and tuck the end in. Then I'm going to do another line of tabby to reestablish some plain yarn. I work 3 or 4 rows of white, and then I'm going to switch over to teal. And again, this is another place where you can get creative and change colors as you want, because we're just going to build up some fabric as we go. I'm getting fancy with a whole bunch of different colors and doing some stripes. You'll see when you work one row of a color, you'll get a little pop of that color every other warp because it's hidden behind every other warp. But if you work 2 rows of a color, they'll fill in and you'll get a more solid line. So if you see, the teal just has these little dots across, and then the purple, I worked multiple rows, so it's a solid line. Often if I'm working with multiple colors and I'm going to rotate between the 2, I will not cut my yarn and leave them attached to a needle with multiple needles going, and then just work the color up along the side until I'm ready to use it again. I've worked quite a few inches of fabric here, changing colors, making a little pattern. Now it's time to learn a new stitch called the Soumak Stitch, and it makes this big poofy braid looking thing. We're going to be doing it with our top, but you absolutely can do it with yarn. And I measure out at least 3.5 lengths across so that I know I have enough wool to use to get back and forth. I split it in half because it's a little thick. So I even up my ends and I fold it over. And then starting with the bottom strand, I'm going to go over 2 warps, around, and come up. And then I'm going to skip 2 warps and I'm going to go around the next 2 again. And I go past the warp, around the back and up, pulling it towards the top of the loom. So right to left, and then the working yarn should be on top of the wraps that you just did. Skip 2 warps and go to the next 2. skip 2 warps, go past those 2 warps and around and towards the top. Then I give them a little tug, make sure they're nice and even. Beat them down gently with my hands. Then we're going to do the same thing with the top half of our roving. And I start right here at the beginning and I wrap it around the first 2 warps. And you'll want to squish it down. Don't just pull, but try to maneuver the wool around those warps. Skip 2 warps, go to the second one. And here you'll see we're pulling down. So you skip 2 warps, and then you go past the second 2, wrap around the back, and then we're pulling down towards the bottom of our frame instead of the top of the frame. And that just makes the wrapping that you're doing wrap into each other between the bottom row and the top row, and that's what creates this braid effect. And sometimes I have to go back and readjust some of the wool and how it's wrapping around each of those so that I get a nice even look across all the stitches. Skip 2, wrap around the back, pulling it down. So you get to the very end. And then we have a nice little braid. And then I'll just open up the roving here and pull it off so I don't have too much of a tail hanging out back there. And then I just tuck the whole thing to the back of the frame to be dealt with at the very end when I need to work in my ends. I'm going to work a row of plain weave. I'm going to take this time to do a row of twining to help reestablish our warps because they got pretty squished. Working twining is never a bad idea. It's a stabilizing stitch and it's a really nice decorative stitch as well. So just as a refresher, anytime the weft goes over a warp, you want to go behind just that one warp string from left to right, top to bottom, and then work a twining across the whole row. And I go back and tighten it up so that they're locked in against each other. If you don't do it while you're working it, you're going to have to do this and pick back and forth with your needle and your fingernails. And then beat it down nicely. That'll help your Soumak stitch poof out, and look how nice and even my warps are getting. They're not squished together anymore. I've worked a few more inches in plain weave and have some nice fabric space between my Soumak stitch and my next decorative element, so I'm going to play around with some strips of top. I'm finding the center 2 warps so that I can make sure that is out. And then I decided, instead of doing 2 by 2, I'm actually going to do this 1 by 1. This top has been split nice and thin, and so there is room here for your poofs to do their little poofy magic without getting squished too much if you go 1 by 1 by 1, just like a plain tabby weave, but instead of tightening it across the row, you're allowing the wool to do its poof. But for this white top, I decided it's a little bit thicker, so I'm going to go over 2 under 2 again. And that's the fun part of this modern weaving. You can change up your pattern depending on the material you're using. So here with my thicker top, I decided to do 2 by 2s instead of 1 by 1. And then adjust them so they're even across the whole row. And continue working in whatever pattern you establish between your colors and your thicknesses of top to make some fun effects. We're going to go in super speed so I can get all this done. And now you're just going to finish up with whatever kind of color pattern you might want to use. Let your imagination soar. You can add in your yarn and change colors at will, and your roving wherever you see fit. I'm just kind of doing my own thing now as I get some fabric made. Now that we're at the top, we're going to do a nice neat little hem stitch. You're going to wrap around the last warp, and then for the next stitch you're going to wrap again behind that far right warp. Then you're going to go behind the next one as well. So you're going to be behind 2 warps, and you're going to drop down into that bottom row of tabby, picking up that last weft. And you're going to continue in this pattern where you go behind the warp string that you just went under and then catch the next warp. So you're going behind 2 warps and down a row. You're going to keep working in this way where you're back wrapping. It'll feel like a whip stitch in embroidery, and you're catching that last row of weft to help anchor it down. And I like to tighten and beat down as I go for my hem stitch, so I know exactly where it's going to land. When you get to the end, I wrap around the last warp and the last bit of weft, if I can, to help lock it all in there. I'm just going to poke my needle to the back and turn the frame over, and I turn my frame upside down too. And then I'm going to wiggle into the last channel of weft stitches to secure my end. And these cheap needles have a very large eye, so just be careful as you're pulling it. You don't mess up your wefts too much. Cut it off. And now we have a big mess of ends to fix. And I go through and clean up all the ends that I caught as I was weaving to get them out of the way. There are going to be some that I did not take care of while I was weaving. I'll show you how to work those in. If you're dealing with a yarn end that you didn't secure, all you're going to do is throw it on your needle and wiggle down one of those channels like I did with my tail. Each of your wefts creates a channel along a warp, and you can just slip those ends right into it. And when it comes to the wool, it's a little bit trickier, and I find bubbles of wool that I can secure the ends into. If you have a space where you went over 2 warps, those are great places to weave in wool ends. Now that all our ends are woven in, we're going to take it off the loom. I start with the 2 knots on either side because they have a nice handle to grab onto to pop them off. And then you need to go warp by warp and pull them off the pegs with your fingernails. And they get tighter as you go. Sometimes I use my needle, sometimes a fork to help pop them off. Now there will be a tiny bit of space down at the very bottom where the warps wrapped around our loom. And so I take the whole piece and I slide it down as much as I can so that it settles right on the bottom of the warps. This is also why I create that closed circuit at the very beginning, so there's no knots to tie in your warps at the end. We can just slide it down. I'm sticking my top warps on a fork so that I can hold them all steady and evenly and pull against them. Slide the whole piece down. This is a great technique for a small piece. If you have a really big tapestry, it's not the best way to do it. There are other better methods, but it works really well for these small ones. Then I'm going to just tuck in my bottom knots. And the top loops, you can take a stick and just slip them right on. And because I'm a knitter, I have a habit of putting the right post to the front and the left post to the back. And that is a perfectly acceptable way to hang your wall hanging. However, if you want to get fancy, I'm going to show you a way to do a little loopy thing. I'm going to use my fork to hold them. And I'm going to go one by one and make sure the loop is nice and open. You fold it over itself, open it up and grab the sides and then slip your stick through. And keep them nice and loose until the very end. And here we keep the loop open, make sure it's not twisted. Put your fingers through, fold them over. And those side loops that are created are where your stick's going to go. You're pinching your fingers, opening your fingers and wrapping and folding over, and then sliding your stick in. Carefully. If your stick has any little nubbies, you want to make sure you're getting past those. Just continue all the way down your warps until everybody's on the stick. And then Before you get it too tight, make sure all the warps are hanging straight on your stick, especially if you have little branches or nubbies that are hanging out. So you have to get it on the right side of that. And then you just give it all a pull. And there you go. Now to create a little hanger, I cut off a length of my warping thread and put a slip knot on each end and then tighten it up. And then the long ends that are left, I just wrap around the stick and give it a good knot onto the hanger section. And you can go back in with a little bit of glue, put a little glue dot on those ends and smooth them on down if you don't want them sticking out. There you go. You have a beautiful wall hanging. I'd love to hear how yours went, and if you have any questions for me. There are a lot more projects for you to explore here in the studio, so make sure you subscribe and check out the next video.